Good evening. I'd like to call tonight's meeting of the Middle School Building Committee to order. What is today? April 14th. April 14th. This is a meeting of the Middle School Building Committee. It's also posted as a, what's that? Oh, no, we will. It's also posted as a school committee meeting, and the city council's all invited. I guess it's posted as well, since you're all here. So I'd ask you to join me and stand and pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, thank you all. I'm Mayor Mike Cahill, and I will ask you folks, when you first have a chance to speak, whether it's to ask a question, make a comment, that you introduce yourselves. You've all got agendas, excuse me, and essentially this meeting will be about a presentation by City Finance Director Bryant Ailes on the city's financial status and plan for building and paying for the middle school. And after that, after Brian's presentation, there'll be some Q&A. Then we'll get a presentation from the architects, AI3, who will present a bit of an update on a bit of how we've gotten to where we are and where we are in terms of the design of the school. And that may essentially be the agenda at that point. But first, we just have a little bit of business for the school building committee members. And the first would be approval of meeting minutes for the March 10th, 2015 meeting.
So moved.
So moved, seconded? Second. All those in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it. Those minutes are approved. Also, we have meeting minutes for the March 31st, 2015 meeting. I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes.
So moved.
Any second?
Second.
Discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes have it. The minutes are approved. And with that, I'm going to turn it right over to Mr. I'm sorry?
Call to order the other committees? No.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Brian.
I call to order the April 14, 2015 School Committee of the Whole.
And who is the Vice President of the City Council here?
Who's number 3?
That would be you. That would be the Dean.
Dean Martin. I've been waiting to hear that.
Councilor Martin, would
Call
you?
to order the City Council.
Okay, thank you all. So we'll have a presentation from Mr. Ailes now, and there's a PowerPoint that goes with it. We will provide you, before you leave tonight, if you want to take with you a printout copy of this. But for now, we'll all be listening to Brian. There will be a Q&A, but please hold questions till the end. So if you have questions that arise, just jot them down and we'll get to those. Brian, thank you.
Thank you. Great to see everyone here tonight. I know we're hopeful we can talk a little bit about the city's finances and the affordability of the middle school. You know, this has been a process that we've all been involved with now for quite some time, and we know the project before us is one that certainly meets the academic needs of our kids and really adheres to the educational plan that so many countless hours were put into to develop. But the question that I grapple with and have since the beginning of this project is really how much will the school cost the city? And the second question to that is, how will the city pay for it? So these two questions I'm going to walk you through tonight, and then we'll take any questions about some of the details of it and get into any aspects of it you might feel we need to. So when we look at how much the school will cost the city, we're going to break it down into two components. The total project cost, which is important to understand, but just as important is how much of that total project that Mass School Building Authority will participate in. And at what level. When it comes to the total project costs, to date we've done a number of things collectively as a committee. Our design team has done some things, and our OPM has done some things to really arrive at what we feel is a comfortable range for where we think that the total project cost is going to be. When we brought on our designers a while ago, they had about 8 or 9 different options that they performed the feasibility study on. And at that time, they were able to provide some rough estimates on all of those options. This committee voted to move forward with option 1A, and we submitted that to MSBA. And at that point in time, it allowed us to go back to both our designers and our OPM and have them get some independent cost estimates. So this was a much more refined analysis which looked at the industry, where it was headed, what components of the school we really needed to plan for, and they were able to further refine that budgetary estimate, which is where we're at right now. And we know as we go through the next phase of this project, which is the schematic design phase, we're continuing to refine that design. So as the design continues to take shape, this range of cost will become more and more clear to us. But for now, in my world, it's important that we plan for the range of potential costs associated with this project. So we'll be undertaking some variations in the design, which will have some impact on the overall cost. And we also anticipate having an opportunity to do some value engineering, which is really taking a look at the components that go into the middle school and utilizing the most efficient materials, and not only for the upfront cost, but also the long-term maintenance of the building and the long-term life of the building as well. So we hope that that will have a positive impact on the current estimates as well. So when we look at this, where are we? We're anywhere from $115.3 million, which is the low cost estimate that we've seen so far, up to $123 million, and obviously these are rounded numbers. Now the $123 million number is our highest estimate that we've seen to date. That places the per square footage construction cost at $420 per square foot. The $115.3 million price tag places the per square footage construction cost at $390 per square foot. And to give you some reference, because these numbers are large, but to give you some reference on are these numbers in line with what we would expect to see with similar projects, this is a slide that our OPM Heary shared with us either the last meeting or the meeting before, which shows some per square footage costs of similar projects if they were built today. And this really takes the escalation for industries and materials and, whoops, sorry about that. There we go. Down here you can see the per square footage cost, which is up in the range of the high threes, 397, 394, 380 for similar type projects. So when we're talking about a per square footage cost of 420 at the high end and 390 at the low end, we're very optimistic that we can be closer to that low end through some cost refinement and design refinements that don't compromise the educational quality of the building. So this is the range I'm planning for. So what I hope to do is now break those costs down into what MSBA will and won't participate in, so we can get at that net cost for the city. So the rate of reimbursement that MSBA currently will reimburse the city for is 51.42%. And we know that there's opportunity to gain another 4.5%, which we're fairly confident we will, through a number of means, which will bring our estimated reimbursement rate up to 55.92%. We are going with a CM at risk model, and that will generate an additional 1% in reimbursement. The maintenance plan has been submitted, and we're expecting that to generate an additional 1.5%. And the use of energy efficient technology in the construction of the new building and the maintenance of the new building will generate another 2%, bringing us to that 55.92. Now, this is a great number. It means that, in theory, more than half of our project costs would be reimbursed, but the real issue is that this rate is only applicable to the costs that the Mass Building Authority says are eligible for this reimbursement. So we need to actually peel back another layer and say, of that total project budget cost, what are the components and how much is MSBA going to participate in? So there are costs that are eligible and there are costs that are ineligible. We know, for instance, the cost of a lot of the auditorium will be ineligible. We also know, for instance, that asbestos abatement, legal and permitting fees, moving expenses are all costs that MSBA will not participate and reimburse us on. So those components are 100% the cost of the city. Some things that they will participate in, obviously some soft costs, which are our designer costs, our OPM fees up to a certain threshold, which we anticipate being at or under in all our budget scenarios. And construction costs, of course, they're going to participate in. Now, this one is really a sensitive one because they actually cap this at $287 per square foot. So for every $287 we spend, they'll participate and reimburse us at the $55.97. But for anything above $287 per square foot, they're not going to participate in, which means that it's 100% on the city. Another component that they cap is the FF&E cost, which is furnishing, fixtures, and equipment. Thanks. And that is capped at $2,400 per student. So anything above that, the city would assume full responsibility for as well. Currently, in our budget scenarios, we're anticipating that we shouldn't exceed that. So that brings us to, how much will it cost the city? So we know what the price range is for the overall project. We know what the potential reimbursement is from MSBA. So this actually represents a worst case scenario. So if none of the MSBA caps were adjusted, and if the project was on the high end of our budget, or the high end of the estimate, that would mean that the city would pick up $69.1 million of this project. Now I want to emphasize that that's the worst case scenario. That's the high end that we could possibly see. But I also wanted to note that this is only a reimbursement rate of 43.82%, not the 55.92 that has been stated publicly and that we kind of expected. But the flip side to this is if the MSBA caps were adjusted, particularly the cost per square footage construction cap, if that were shifted and the overall budget came in at 115.3, which is $390 per square foot, the city would assume a cost of $53.5 million, which is much closer to the stated reimbursement rate of 55.97 at 53.7. So, as I'm planning for this and modeling this in debt models and trying to figure out when the borrowing occurs and all that stuff, I'm playing with a range essentially. So I want to make sure we've got a plan for the worst case scenario and a plan for the best case scenario. And odds are, knowing what we know, we'll be somewhere in the middle there. So I'm dealing with a $16 million range in terms of the actual cost to the city that the city would need to borrow for. So how do we pay for that? So here I'd like to talk a little bit about what our existing obligations are as a city and also what capacity exists to assume new debt. I want to talk a little bit about the cash flow needs of the project because that's going to determine at what points in time we need to borrow money. And then we'll talk about the actual cost of that debt, and I also want to talk about reserve funds, which may be utilized to help offset some of the budgetary pressure we might see. So this is a lot of numbers, I know, but welcome to my world. This is a schedule which shows all of our existing debt up top. These are committed amounts by fiscal year. And what you can see that's interesting about this is you see a sharp decline from 2020 out through the out years. In fact, when you add the lower section of projects here, which we'll be bonding for permanently tomorrow, you can see that the total obligation for FY16 for our debt service is at $8.3 million. That's what we budget for in FY16. That'll be in the budget. In FY25, there's $2.6 million that's left. So you can see that this capacity begins to show itself, and that is when we'll begin to layer in some of the middle school debt. This is a slide, it's a different way of looking at it, but I like this one because it shows what a reasonable growth in a debt budget looks like. So we're assuming in this scenario, up top, the orange line, a 2.5% annual growth in the debt budget. Now, the city's budget over the last few years has grown anywhere from 3.2 to 3.7%. So a 2.5% assumed growth rate is not unreasonable. Yeah, there are some other components of the city's budget that grow in excess of a 3.5%, but the 2.5% we feel is very responsible. So this shows a different way. Each column represents each year's total debt service, and you can see here it creates much, the capacity that we're looking for to begin layering in this new debt. So in order to determine at what point we layer in that debt, we need to look at what the cash flow needs are for the project. So I've worked with Heery, and we worked with our finance advisor to come up with a few different cash flow models for similar type projects. One is a very straight line model, and the other is more of a bell curve or an S curve, I've heard it called. And we know based on these, we've actually pulled them apart a little bit, and we know that this bell curve tends to be more in line with what we see, but we also know that it doesn't take into account some of the initial upfront costs that we're going to have. So what we've done is we've modified this a little bit to say what we reasonably expect to occur in terms of when the cash needs to leave our hands and go to the contractors and pay all the bills for the construction. Based on this cash flow need, and based on the expected MSBA reimbursement rates, we're able to determine exactly at what point we would need to borrow and at what level to sufficiently pay for the cash needs of the project. And here's what that looks like. So you can see in December of 2015 will be the first time we actually borrow for this project, given the existing timeline that we've all seen. And that will facilitate the upfront costs. And then the biggest chunk coming in August of 16, where 62.3% of the overall net cost to the city would be borrowed. Now, these are percentages of the net costs. The reason I'm showing you as percentages is because, remember, we're talking about a range of budget. So if we're talking about the $115 million scenario, it's still going to be 10% in December of 15. That's what the model dictates. So given these timeframes for when we need to borrow, and given what we know the capacity to be within our debt service budget, here's what the new debt service for the middle school looks like at that 53.5% figure. Okay? I'm sorry, 53.5%, which is the net that the city will assume. You can see here there's a 3-year period where we exceed the reasonable growth in the debt budget by $2.8 million over a 3-year period. So this is really the gap I'd be looking to plan for, to be able to offset. In the worst case scenario, that grows to in the $69.1 million of net debt. We would be looking at a $6.7 million in budgetary pressure over the course of 5 years. Now, another assumption that's built in here that I didn't really highlight here, but it's important, is the level at which we're borrowing these funds, the interest rates, okay? And we've got very conservative interest rates in there right now. We've got our long-term debt at an average of 5%, which is very high, and we've got our short-term debt at an average of 2%. And just to give you a perspective, last April we did a borrowing, and the net interest rate to the city was 0.123%. We're estimating 2%. Just to be careful here. We don't want to have any surprises later on, and it's better to err on the side of caution and prepare for the worst and plan and work towards a better scenario. So, just to give you an idea of what 1% in interest means, this same scenario of $69.1 million, if it were 1% interest less, it reduces the budgetary pressure by $2.6 million over that span, and it becomes just a $4.1 million imbalance over the course of 4 years. So there's so many, the reason I do this is because there's so many variables at play here, and any one of them can shift what the real cost is to the city. And so we wanted to just make sure we plan for every possible scenario in the worst possible situation and what that would look like. And that's that previous slide of the 6.7 million. So how would we cover that potential shortfall or potential budgetary pressure? This is an option here, and we've got reserve balances that we've very consciously begun to build over the last few years. Started with the previous administration, and they began to really set aside funds in anticipation of this middle school. In FY14, the mayor actually put forth a stabilization fund policy, and the council approved it, which requires the city to put aside 10% of its annual free cash certification, and that's a minimum level, at least a minimum of 10%. So in FY14, we did that, and you can see there the value of that is just about $9 million in total reserves. Once we certified this amount of free cash, which was 7.2 of that 9 million, remember we have to put 10% aside. The mayor put forth a request to put half of that aside into the stabilization fund. So now we've got close to $5 million in our stabilization fund, and this is how we expect it to grow over the next couple years. We know that from FY15 to FY16, there'll be some additional cash inserted there from the sale of the McKay building. And then we anticipate a very modest 10% increase in the overall deposit, which is required now by policy. So this is important to note because when we were looking at that budgetary pressure, the pressure really began at the start of FY18. It wasn't an issue for 16, it wasn't an issue for 17. FY18 is really when we first saw the debt service go above the budget. And so we'd be looking at FY17 values to potentially fund an FY18 imbalance. So given that, what's our plan from here? We've got a lot of work to do. We're very far from knowing this answer definitively, but I've shown you a worst case scenario, and I've given you a plausible way to navigate through that and fund this middle school. But we still need to do some work. We've got to refine our figures and the cost assumptions and get that number down. We're committed to getting that number down below 400. How close to that 390 number we can get, I think, is still left to be seen, but I think we're all committed to getting there. And we also need to do the value engineering, and there's still design modifications that are going to take place. That's going to affect the overall value of the school. We need to view that through a cost lens without losing sight of the educational goals of the school. You never want to compromise that. So the other piece we're doing here, the third bullet, is we know that MSBA periodically revisits some of their stated caps, and the mayor has been actively working with the executive director at MSBA, the state treasurer, other cities and towns to help shed some light on the potential issue in terms of construction costs being so far above what the MSBA is willing to participate in that it potentially at some point could mean that cities and towns aren't able to fund their schools that they so desperately need. So we're working with them, and we'll continue to do that to hope that we can influence some of those cap revisions. And we expect that in June, although I've also heard they might push that out another meeting. We've got to continue to refine our cash flow and debt models. This is something that the more and more we know about the project and the more we can refine the cost and the calendar, the more we'll be able to get a more certain number about those cash flow needs. And then the last two really speak to our conservative budgeting in operating budgets. So we know that we want to try to be able to have sufficient reserves to not only weather any budgetary imbalance we might have on our debt structure, but also excuse me, but also we want to, we don't want to hurt our service operations either. That was the point I wanted to make. So we don't want to just throw money in areas just to increase budgets is what it boils down to. We want to be very conscious about our spending decisions in hopes that, and this leads me to the last bullet, that we're able to be able to make additional deposits into the city reserves and add to them whenever possible. So I hope that gives you a very broad understanding of kind of where we're at financially as a city and how this building is affordable, even in a worst case scenario, although we know and we hope we won't be at that far end of the spectrum. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions and we can get into some specifics.
Before Mr. Ailes takes questions, if you would go back to the slide where you showed some comparative costs, I want you to highlight, if you would for a minute, how we've projected out the high school costs to compare to the middle school costs were we building the high school today or on the same timetable. And after that, I'll just frame how we're going to do the questions, the questioning period here. There you are.
This one? So these projects, and I'll also look to Hiri too to help explain this a little bit, but these are projects that were very similar in terms of their size and their scope. So we've taken 3, Lynn, Milford, Lunenburg, and we've taken their actual costs to construct those, and then we've added in escalators, industry escalators. We know the costs of labor have increased. We know the costs of steel and all the materials have increased, and that gets us to an escalated cost at the point which we would break ground and lock into our costs for the middle school. So we wanted to get it apples and apples, and what that shows when you break it down to a square footage is that the cost per square footage is very much in line with what our target area would be, around 390, and we don't feel that that's unreasonable given these other projects and what they cost. Now for the high school, there is a little bit difference in the square footage cost, and it's my understanding that there's a couple factors that played into that. One was it wasn't an entirely new construction project. A lot of the building was saved in terms of the field house, the cafeteria, I believe, that helped bring down those per square footage costs. And this was also only built for 1,200 students, whereas the middle school is built for 13, well, we're proposing it for 1,395, I think is the number.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Ailes. And just to kind of to follow up on that point, the cost per square foot, we realized significant savings on the renovation of the field house particularly. In terms of the overall project costs, they are close, but as Mr. Ailes said, another difference can be seen in the fact that the middle school will be built for 200 more students. And don't forget the fact that we will not be reimbursed for the auditorium at the middle school. And that was not the case at the high school. But even so, when you look at the high school, if we were to build it on the same timetable as the middle school, the costs are very, very close. So what I'd like to do, we want to have as much Q&A as we can, recognizing that at a certain point we'll need to move on to the presentation by AI3. So anybody who wants to ask a question, please, when I call on you, and I'll call on you, please explain, identify who you are, and you can have a question and one follow-up if you need, and then we'll move on. And if we get to where everybody's asked and we have a little more time and somebody wants another go-around, they can do that. So with that in mind, who wants to lead off questions for Mr. Ailes?
Can I just, one more
Sure.
thing? The cost for the high school there, the estimated cost, that's construction costs, is that correct?
Correct. We're talking
It's not
about
total
square
project
footage
cost.
for construction only.
The total project cost, again, in the same time frame would be,
Oh, thank you. What do we have it at, 106 or thereabouts?
For the
108?
high school?
The total project cost?
For the high school was about 83 or 84.
No.
and if we projected it.
Brought out to 2017. I think you had it at, I know you had that and it was in an earlier iteration of the slide. It was either 106 or 108.
I
And
don't
as compared to
recall, yeah.
115 or on up. Okay. So again, bringing it much closer in line. Dr. Hershey?
Just one other quick add, because you might ask, why are we looking at 1,400 for the middle school? The high school's at 1,340 right now, so it was built for 1,200, but we're at 1,340 and climbing. So we are already looking at probably those 4 grades hitting the neighborhood of 1,400.
Yes, Councilor Rand.
Thank you. Estelle Rand, Ward 2 City Councilor. Can you help me understand and explain a little, how does this planned debt service affect future projects? Would there be a freeze on future projects like the police station or even road work, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with such a range right now. I appreciate the question because it's something, we think about every day. We're trying to do more with less every time we sit down to build a budget. We're dealing with such a range right now that I can't say with certainty how much of the projects would be pushed off and how much wouldn't. I can tell you that even with our most recent cost estimates of this school, in a worst-case scenario, and knowing that the next large projects that are on the horizon, like the police station and like the public works facility, those begin to become more reasonable to take on around 2020, when some of that other debt begins falling off. Some of the smaller projects, such as road work and the ad hoc, emergency type needs, we would hope to be able to make those judgment calls at the time and say, is this a priority? And if so, are there other areas that we might be able to find some capacity within? I mean, we're dealing with, this year's budget was passed at $110 million. We expect FY16's budget to be at 114 and some change. And so you can imagine that by the time we bring on this debt, we're talking a budget of about $120+ million. So there could be some capacity in other areas to assume some of those projects.
Thank you.
Councilor Lang?
Yeah, David Lang, Ward 1 City Council. Right, about a year ago, I think you had given us a report from the Financial Forecasting Committee, and in that you were projecting budget deficit incomes of about $2 million for FY16 and 17. Has that changed, or is that in addition to what?
It has. I mean, that process is one to highlight the potential lever points in the budget. So what tends to happen is that the revenue estimates tend to be very conservative and the expenditure estimates tend to be very aggressive, creating these notable potential deficiencies. And they're all noted in the narrative, and it's a collective process that's undertaken by the City Council. The school committee has representation there, along with Kathy Griffin, the budget analyst, and myself. So we collectively come up with a very conservative approach to what the future looks like. We do know, as we're quickly approaching the end of FY15, that revenues continue to be strong, exceeding our budgets. And the expenditures, we're very conscious about containing this year in anticipation of being able to place additional funds into these reserves and help with that budgetary pressure that we know will exist at a minimum of 3 years, FY18, 19, and 20, possibly 4 years, for a tune of about, in the best case scenario, it's about $800,000 a year on average. In the worst case, it's more like, I think, 1.2, 1.3 that we'd be looking to help minimize.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Councilor St. Hilaire?
Thank you. I really appreciate this slide with the comps. In looking at this, I noticed that the other middle schools seem to be well below what we're projecting the Beverly Middle School to be. Are these 5 through 8 models, or are there other comps out there of 5 through 8 models that are in the range of what we're anticipating?
Just a quick point. One of those is an elementary, 2 are middle. I'm not sure, you can't tell from that whether they are renovation additions or new construction. Does Heary have that information?
Excuse me, I was.
Yeah,
But I just said, you can't tell from looking at it. One's an elementary school, the other 2 are middles, but you can't tell if they're renovation additions or if they're new construction, in addition to what the grade configurations are. They're all new.
They are brought those to our attention because I think they were comparable, meaning they're new construction one. So,
And are they 5 through 8 middle schools?
no, I don't believe so. Yeah, 6 through 8.
And are there any 5 through 8 models being built currently that are comparable?
No, I think it's more of an order of magnitude of square footage. You know, again, the school cost, the programming would be very similar. It's just the size and the scale of that project.
Yeah, I don't, thank you. I'd also, you know, we know that Wakefield just built a 5 to 8, but it's not listed there because they went out to bid a couple years earlier, and their cost didn't yet reflect that, you know, that increased trend
Right.
above the cap. So, but I'm not sure what you're
I
looking for.
guess I'm just curious, are these 3, I guess, considered the most comparable to what we're?
They're the most recent, and I think they are within the range of where we're trying to get. I think, again, going back with what Brian had said earlier, the initial step, the estimates were conservative. Now we're trying to move into that.
So
phase.
they're the most recent in that they went out to bid in the last few months, right? We're trying to be current with comparative costs, and we're looking at them really specifically to compare the cost per square foot of construction. Does that make sense?
Makes sense, thank you.
Okay, Dean Martin?
Yes, Don Martin, Ward 5 Councilor. Brian, you mentioned his interest rates earlier, and a 2% worst-case scenario, maybe. What happens if it's worse than that? What's the backup plan? And how did you get the 2%?
We work with a financial advisor when it comes to borrowing, and at his advisement, he suggested that we set the rates there because it's planning for the worst case. Sure, interest rates could rise above that. If they were to, you know, along with that would be many other assumptions that we'd know more definitively. So this is a model that we're constantly refining. Every time we get a change in the assumptions, we're plugging it back in and we're seeing, okay, now what's the range look like? You know, what we've done here is to try to really give you a worst case scenario. I guess hypothetically, if you know rates were to go up, we'd need to revisit this. We'd need to take another look at where our stabilization reserves are, and if any other capacity existed, we'd be looking at a backup plan at that point. We'll know more definitively, though, Counselor, tomorrow morning, which way interest rates are trending, because we've got a very large borrowing that's being bid on tomorrow. So that'll give us a little more insight into the industry.
Would we have clear options if interest rates do climb and our costs go up?
And the costs go up. So, you know, we've been, I guess at that point, we would probably need to take a very close look at where we might be able to refine some of the estimates or the costs associated with the project. We might be looking at other areas of the budget for some relief.
Sorry, if I could, I'm thinking more after the school is built, like 5 years down the road. All of a sudden, interest rates, they're not going to stay
We'll be
low
locked
forever.
in. We'll be locked in. So
Right.
we'll have permanent bonds that have a stated coupon rate on them at the time of offering, and that's what we can budget towards. We'll know at that point in time. Does that answer your
Yeah.
question?
You know,
If there's any fluctuation in the market at that point, it really would affect any future borrowings we have.
Okay, that's good enough for now. Thanks.
Counselor Hausman?
Yeah, Scott Hausman, City Councilor, Ward 4. Yeah, Brian, I have 2 questions, really. One is, near the beginning of your presentation, you talked about adjustments to the MSBA reimbursement, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, how much it would be, why would they do it, what is reasonable to expect. And then my second really has to do with the prudence or the advisability of using the stabilization fund for a known cost or gap in the budget versus using it for unanticipated or emergency purposes.
Sure.
Mr. Ailes, let me take a first cut at that, since I've been working directly on the cap issue. So on the counselor's second question, I'll leave most of that to you, except to say that as we created the stabilization fund collectively, clearly one of the stated concerns was to plan towards the middle school project, and an expectation that we would very likely need some of that fund we're building now to help with the cost of that. So that, that's one piece, but I know Mr. Ailes can speak more fluently to that. On the cap question, and you saw that in that slide that showed what recently bid school projects around the state are costing per square foot. The MSBA was at a cap of $285 per square foot for several years. And a year ago, they raised it, where they were $275, and they raised it to $287 last year. I've met with both the director at MSBA and more recently with the state treasurer to make the case that if they don't raise their cap significantly in acknowledgement of the fact that the construction costs have risen and will continue to rise, then they are going to effectively be undercutting their own commitment and promise to communities. When the statute was passed creating MSBA and they set up shop, a value judgment was made that a community like Beverly, a community with Beverly's demographics, really warranted a reimbursement, a base reimbursement of about 52%. That we should be expected to be able to carry somewhere in the range of, mid-40s or thereabouts of the cost, a percentage of the cost. They're undercutting that commitment if they don't raise their cap. They feel a certain pressure to get more projects in the front door and say yes to more communities. We're trying to help make the case that if they don't share appropriately with communities in the cost, then they're going to be undermining communities who are already in the pipeline, already in the process like ours. They're going to be undermining our ability to build the schools that we know that our kids and our communities need. It's a conversation that's gone well to this point with both the treasurer and the head of MSBA, and the treasurer oversees the Mass School Building Authority. We've also been reaching out to other communities that are at similar places in the process and starting to see the same type of cost estimates we're seeing in hopes that they'll get on board with the effort to advocate successfully with MSBA to raise their cap. I've already gotten a couple of mayors to say, well, one community without a mayor, one community that's a town, and another community that's a city, to say that they want to join with us in making that case. Well, we've already made the case to the treasurer, so now we're kind of collecting up other communities and their leaders to help make the case. Our goal is that MSBA will raise the cap. I think there's a very good chance. Will they raise it all the way up to, to what the bids are saying? Will they raise it up and add an escalator so that our bid, which won't happen for another 15, 16 months, so that they could share completely in that cost? That might be overly optimistic, but getting them to acknowledge that their cap is too low and to raise it in a meaningful way, I think we have a good shot at that. Mr. Ailes said that was likely to happen at their June meeting. That's what they have planned, but I know the treasurer, just in the job for a couple of months, wants to take a real good look at it, so it may be pushed out a month or two. As you know, our schedule, our timeline calls for the district, the city, and MSBA to agree on a project funding agreement at the September 30th board meeting of the MSBA. So between now and June, and between June and late September, it will all come very clear what the cap will be. We're hoping it'll be significantly higher than it is now, and that'll take us closer to the low end of that range of costs that Mr. Ailes put up before. But that's an ongoing process, and there's no magic to it. It's getting as many communities who share in our concerns to advocate well with their legislators and with MSBA and the Treasurer's Office.
If I may, before Brian answers my second question, has the MSBA ever done that, gone through an adjustment period before, or they have not been around long enough to run into the situation before?
Well, as I said, they raised the cap a year ago from 275 to 287. I'm not sure how long they've been working with it at 275, whether that was from the onset. It seemed, okay. So they've been in place for about 8 years, roughly? 8, 9?
Created in 2004, projects the high school was one of the first projects, so 2006, 2007 was.
Yeah, they were still getting their practices and their rules in place as we were building our high school. So the first increase in the cap was last year. We're looking for them to increase it 2 years in a row. But the cost pressures are getting pretty severe. Projects were being built consistently up until the last couple of years below their $275 cap. So this is new, but it's mounting and it's increasing, this pressure on building costs that they're seeing, that all the communities that are trying to build are seeing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Ailes?
Sure. So stabilization funds and use of them. Stabilization funds are a healthy thing, obviously, for cities and towns to have. I recently, it was either yesterday or the day before, had a call with Standard & Poor's to reaffirm the city's bond rating for our offering tomorrow. And obviously disclosed the potential for the middle school, the potential use of the reserve funds as an option. And they reaffirmed our bond rating, long-term. So that, to me, says that it's a mindful use of the stabilization funds. That's what they're intended to do. That's what the policy states. They're there to weather any short-term storms. I think where a city or town could run into problems is if you rely on the stabilization fund to fund your typical ongoing operating costs. And where this is a defined period with which we're seeing this budgetary pressure, we're just looking for a 3 or 4 year solution to an issue. And I'll reiterate that this is our backup plan. We want to do a lot before we even get to tapping into the reserves. We want to make sure we get this cost to what's reasonable, and we want to make sure we're not compromising any educational components of the school, but we're going to do everything we can to afford this. It'd be great if we didn't need to tap the stabilization funds. And we're going to do, like I said, we're going to do everything we can to try to afford it budgetarily without that. One other point, if I could, is, as a rule of thumb, these rating agencies and finance experts look to kind of a range of reserves for a municipality. 7 to 10% seems to be what gives comfort to rating agencies. Anything above 10%, that's where you see your highest rated municipalities in terms of their borrowings. There's a balance that we want to be mindful of, and that's not to deplete this so much, whether it's this project or whether it's, an administration 10 or 20 years from now, because that has a direct effect on the cost of projects, because your bond rating gets affected, therefore your interest rates get affected, and things can cost more if you're too quick to dip into the cookie jar. So we're going to do everything we can to avoid that, but it is a possibility.
So if I may, just to follow up on that, then if the worst-case scenario were to occur, you sort of answered part of my question, which was, how much would we have left over? What would be the absolute dollar amount versus the percentage dollar amount in your chart if we had to use all of the stabilization funds in a worst-case scenario? What would we have left over if there was an emergency that
Okay.
obviously, by definition, is unanticipated?
So this is pretty hypothetical, but we're looking at a 6.7 million over a 5-year span in in a worst-case scenario. So on average, what's that, about 1.2 million or so a year, 1.1, somewhere in that range. So you would see the reserve balances in FY17 go down by about 1.1 or 1.2 million. And then you would see the FY18 balance go down about 1.1 or 1.2. And this is an average, obviously. The staggering of the debt actually creates a bell curve of cost associated with the borrowings. But so in FY18, you can see we're looking at a balance, it looks like just under 11 million. So if theoretically we didn't have any positive budgetary variances from that point forward, and we had to take it all from the reserve all at once, you'd be looking at, about a $4 million remainder. That is it's so hypothetical that it's not going to happen. We're not going to let that happen because before that happens, we'll make necessary budget adjustments to make sure that we don't dip below a reasonable reserve level that's going to affect our borrowing capacity.
Counselor Silva.
Thank you, Jason Silva, Counselor at Large. Thanks, Brian. It was a great presentation. I appreciated the seeing the reserve balances and how they are going to relate to our increase in debt service. So I think that was really helpful to demonstrate. I'm curious to hear about the other side of things. We're talking about trying to control costs operationally and kind of value engineering this project to the extent we can. And I'm assuming those conversations have started to a degree. So are there any specifics around, I mean, we see the budget every year. We know it's a tough, every year is a tough budget. And to, not to say that it can't be reduced, but, there are trade-offs in reducing the operational budget, as you well know. So are there any conversations happening right now, ongoing, talking about those things?
Now, are you referring to the city's operational budget or the budget for the school?
I'm talking about both.
Both,
So
okay.
value engineering that's happening, or the discussions that are happening around that, and then on the operational side, any conversations related to looking at efficiencies operationally?
Sure. We're always looking for new efficiencies. The one I can think of right off the top of my head is a conversation we had earlier today about solar possibilities in other parts of the city that could potentially give us energy savings, long-term energy savings. I mean, we're constantly looking to refine what it is we're spending money on. We're in the business of less revenue with equal or greater service. I can look to my colleague Dave Jeleno, the purchasing agent here, is one of the staunchest advocates for trimming costs wherever possible, as long as it doesn't affect service. We're currently in discussions about the FY16 budget. We haven't finalized anything yet. We look forward to meaningful discussion with all of the council and citizens about what it is that's important to them, that they wouldn't, that they want to continue, where it is they need, adjustments to the service levels we're providing. That's a dialogue that doesn't occur in a vacuum. That's everyone getting around a table collectively and looking to implement efficiencies where they can, and make judgment calls every year when we develop a budget and present a budget to you. As far as the school goes, I think I might leave that more to our design team and our OPM, because they're constantly refining that building. And they've got a really exciting presentation tonight that's going to talk about some of those differences and potential changes that speak to that. It's looking at ways we can refine the design of the building to continue to provide what we know is educationally necessary for the children that are going there, but doing it in the most efficient way and looking at the long-term cost of the building as well. So, I'm really excited for them to get up and give this presentation too.
That's great. No, thank you.
And I'll just add to that, as you saw a range of possible total project costs, that somewhat reflects a conversation we've been having in an ongoing fashion about what's the absolute least we can spend and get the educational program that we have written, that the school plans to provide, and get a building that will last the way we need it to last. So you want to get to that lower number without crossing under that line where you start compromising the educational program and or using the wrong materials and systems so that the school doesn't last. We want the lifespan of the school to be, as long as possible. So those are the tensions as we push to get to that lower number.
I guess one other comment? And piggybacking off Councilor Rand's comment, what we're seeing, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, with the increase in debt service does not include, that's just with the school, right? That doesn't include any other capital improvements throughout the city, is that correct?
No, well, partly. It doesn't include any general fund funded projects. So the sewer work, the water work, that type of infrastructure that's ratepayer based would continue to take place.
But by and large, it doesn't include a lot of the normal capital improvements that we see for that increase in those warning years or the danger years were identified. So I think it is a healthy conversation to have and talk about those trade-offs and what impacts, especially during those difficult years, that we're going to have to make. So.
Sure. And, this is actually a schedule that we pulled from a capital expenditure plan. And it identifies all the projects that we've currently bonded for. And keep in mind, when we were bonding for a lot of these projects, the city's resources were minimal. I mean, this was during a recession. We needed to get projects done. The only way to do it was to borrow for it. The hope is, and we've been conscious about this when we present a responsible budget every year, is to begin to build in the capital maintenance into the operating budget and minimal capital expenditures in the tunes of $200,000, $500,000 in various areas to continue to replace that equipment, so we don't have to go out and bond for $2 million to replace DPW vehicles or something like that. We're constantly replenishing the inventory to help avoid that. And I would also encourage anyone who's interested to take a look at the capital expenditure plan, because we do put a lot of effort in trying to identify the foreseeable needs of the city over the next 10 years. Granted, it's tough to look out 10 years, but I think it does a pretty good job of identifying what's lying ahead that we know is there.
Dr. Hershey?
So a couple things I would add. This really provides an opportunity to have about as dynamic and exciting middle school program as you can have. And to that end, we've made a lot of commitments as well as a school committee and a school department to do long-range planning from the standpoint of our budgets. We're no longer looking from year to year. We're trying to model what this will look like over the next few years, and how do we build in any costs that we might incur from a staffing standpoint, which in many cases it's not going to be that great, largely because the efficiency of moving to a single building with the fifth grade actually reduces our staffing needs in certain areas. So we're doing that modeling now so that we can make sure that we can feed it to City Hall, so that we can make sure that we're doing responsible budgets over the next several years to make sure that this works. The plan itself, we don't have enough time to do it tonight. I'd be happy to do it for the city council anytime. It's about as exciting as it gets, and it really compels us to think about ways in which we can make this cost effective. And that's where we are. And the big issue is us really thinking about it from a multi-year standpoint of what our budgets really are going to look like, so it becomes pretty predictable from our end too as to what our costs are going to be.
Councilor Silver, that good?
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Frades?
Yeah, John Frades, Ward 6. Brian, I just want to thank you because you always seem to have a way to explain the numbers in a layman's terms, so I thank you for that. My question goes back to the reserve fund, stabilization fund. It looks like there's no opportunity during this 5-year spend down to replenish. Is that the way you're looking at it? Is that my understanding?
Because we want to be conservative.
Yeah.
Yes, that's what we're modeling to show this is worst case here, and it's still doable. What I would reasonably expect to happen is that we continue to get free cash certified, and that we continue to make at a minimum the required 10% deposit into the stabilization fund, and wherever there's other opportunities as the year goes on to constrain any unnecessary spending and sort of force reversions into that stabilization fund, we'll be looking to do that. Sure. This is a worst case scenario with no additional influx of cash, with the exception of the McKay sale.
Okay. School committee member Manzi, and then Roy Gelano.
David Manzi, School Committee Representative, Ward 1. Brian, how have your projections funded the city's pension liability of $85.9 million and the city's OPEB liability of $202 million?
Sure. Great questions, because they're real liabilities that we need to be conscious about. We've got, as school committee, Mr. Manzi mentioned, I believe it's about $85 or $86 million in unfunded pension liability. That's real cost. We're on an aggressive schedule to fund that. And all of our budget models that we've projected out continue to increase that contribution at 4.5% every year. The Retirement Board just recently enacted a new funding schedule which maintains that commitment, and it will fully fund the pension liability by 2032, which is more aggressive than we need to be by law. The OPEB is a little bit different because to this point, the city hasn't contributed much to it. In fact, it hasn't contributed anything. But I'm happy to report that as recently as the last city council meeting, our city council enabled the administration to begin establishment of a trust fund. I've got a draft version of that on my desk this morning, and it's something that we'll be planning for in the near future. It's a significant amount of money. We fund that obligation as a pay-as-you-go. So it's not that we're not funding those obligations, it's just that we build it into the budget every year as part of our health contributions.
I'll just add to that, Mr. Ailes. The requirement that we fully fund our pension liability is a federal and state statutory requirement. There's no such statutory mandate on OPEB as of yet. In that $110 million budget that we're working under this current year, roughly how much is going into our unfunded pension liability?
8.8, I believe.
8.8. So you think about that 8.8 out of 110, that number, that annual amount into the unfunded pension liability will grow. So I think it's a max of about 17 million in the final year.
I think the last year's 14, I think it is.
Okay,
the last year.
so we'll be spending that much annually by 2032 on unfunded pension, after which that number can drop down.
It drops down to about 3 million.
So it down to about 3 million, yeah. So at that point, as I said, there's no current mandate to fund the OPEB liability. We're looking to try to start to make a dent in it. But certainly as we look down the line, and that if and when that mandate comes, I think communities will be looking at when they can dial down their investment in their pension funds and turn some of that funding to the OPEB. OPEB, for those who don't know what it is, so you get your unfunded pension liability. What would happen if local government shut down tomorrow and you had to pay out to everybody, which has not happened in 300 plus years and is not going to happen. So, you know, it's somewhat of an exercise, but that is to pay pensions. OPEB are the healthcare and life insurance costs for retirees. So people who are in retirement get their healthcare paid by their former employer, in this case the city, and their life insurance costs. So those are the OPEB costs, and we will need to start paying attention to them. But as I said, no mandate has come our way yet. Mr. Gelano.
First of all, thank you very much. Very, very helpful. When you came to the conclusion that the worst case scenario is obviously 453.5%?
No, 69.1.
I'm talking about percentages.
Oh, the percentage of the cost to the city in the worst case, the 43. So yeah, 56.18%.
56% is what our net cost would be for the entire project,
Yep.
worst case. What went into coming to that number? Where did you go to get that number?
So MSBA provides a worksheet that's necessary to submit. And before that was due, we actually downloaded it and began plugging in our budgetary numbers. So it basically lays out all of the individual cost areas as they're budgeted for, and then it actually calculates how much of those particular line items are under a specific cap, how much is over a specific cap, and you're able to tally the full column and get at that net cost.
And I had mentioned this at a prior meeting, but I had said to you that I had heard that a middle school in Gloucester was reimbursed at about $15 out of $40 million. Now, I don't know if you've looked into that at all, but that was a number that gave me pause. And so it's just something I would ask you to look at. I don't have access to that information. The other question, I think, has already been answered to some extent tonight, my other question. My question was going to be, when do we start to look at the issues of how to get this cost down? And as I understand it, there's going to be a presentation starting tonight from the designers that's going to start going after that issue. And I asked that question, but it's the same question I've asked a couple of times now, and I think this is very helpful. When do we start making those decisions? And as I understand it, we're not really going to have a real number to work with in terms of the MSBA's reimbursement rate until September. And how far along are we in the design process that we cannot stop making changes in that so that we don't end up in a situation where we have a fire drill to get these costs addressed if we need to.
Yeah, and I think, I wish I had a clearer answer, but I believe the right answer is that it's a layered process. You know, there's multiple phases of refinement that we're going to undertake, and unfortunately, the end result is going to be after we get our bids back from, bidding out our subcontractors and a lot of those other, contracts, so we know exactly what we're obligating to. But we can plan for the worst. The first phase of that refinement is ongoing right now in the schematic design phase. That building is consistently kind of morphing into something that's pretty exciting, and it continues to get refined. That has cost implications. The next phase would be when we get the CM on board, and correct me if I'm wrong, guys, you guys probably know the process much better than I do, but once we get the CM on board, we begin to talk about the components of construction and how they're designed and whether or not there's any opportunity to refine some of those designs. That's the benefit of getting the construction manager on board early. And then at that point, I believe that's when we begin submitting bid packages out to some of the subcontractors. But I'm looking to Tom here because I'm really out of my expertise here.
No, I think the commitment.
Get that microphone, if you would.
Thank you. The commitment that the mayor referred to, the project funding agreement, will occur later this year. And that's really when you put everything comes together with a project that everyone collectively agrees meets the educational program, meets the budget, and the school building committee addresses and votes to move forward. And then the MSBA will require the city to then make a commitment to fund the entire project to the extent it has not already done so. So I think that will occur over the next 6 months. We're pushing hard to get the construction manager on board as soon as possible. The MSBA normally likes to get them on board before the design development phase, which is after the project funding agreement. Through the conversations with the project team, we're moving that up to try to get them on board before that project funding agreement process starts so that we can have them buy in on the budget, that we are working in the right direction and that any type of savings we can have on things that are not visible. Let's say the piles and the foundation systems, we might be able to save some money, and that doesn't affect anything of the quality of the building, but it has a more efficient system that can save money in those areas. So we'll be working with them to try to look at those areas first and then continue to work to develop a project that does meet the educational program that has been set out in front of us. So.
Last question. Weeks, months before you expect the construction manager on board?
Within the next month and a half. I mean, the RFP, the short list is going out shortly. We should be interviewing them probably within the next month. So,
thank you. Thank you.
We've talked about having them on by the third week in May, I think is what we're looking at.
Thank you.
Other questions? Joanna.
Joanna Scott, I'm on the building committee. I just had a question about has there been much discussion? I know the Briscoe building won't be empty until, fiscal 20? Has there been discussion about where that building may lie in surplus, or that's a large piece of land?
Yes. We've been talking about that. My thought is that we will be naming in the not-too-distant future a reuse committee to look at Briscoe. But I'd like to, at least initially, have that reuse committee take on a broader view, looking at Briscoe, looking at City Hall and the police station, looking at the public services facility, looking at more of our public assets. It may be that we very quickly determine that it does not make sense for the city to hold on to Briscoe, and then we may narrow our focus down to, how to surplus it and put it up for sale. But it may be that we find that Briscoe has, some value to the city, and it may be that some other city asset becomes the property that we should, look to surplus and sell. Without getting, really caught up in it, it could be that Briscoe becomes a great idea for City Hall and a new police station. But that might be, that might not be feasible. If that were to be feasible, now you look at City Hall and say, what else could that building, which used to be a private mansion, what else might that be, in a next iteration? So we're looking to try to, we're gathering information right now about what other communities might have done a reuse process effectively and successfully that we can look to. And what are some of the things that you need to have in mind, and what are some of the backgrounds and areas of expertise that you want to make sure you include on that type of a committee? So soon, we don't want to rush it, but sometime in the not-too-distant future, we'll be putting that committee together. Great question.
Yeah,
Thanks.
thank you. I'm glad to hear that's out-of-the-box thinking. Might not know exactly what you're going to do now, but there may be, when you talk about budget cuts or, efficiencies going forward, maybe that's an option.
And I don't want to get people too excited, because it may be totally
Correct,
unrealistic.
to be off the table.
But supposing, holding on to Briscoe does make sense, we might actually eventually decide that we don't have to move the bus yard. I know. Again, it might be totally unrealistic. I know some of you get all
Jesus,
aflutter
Mayor.
about that thought.
Thank you.
So, okay, thanks. Councilor Lang.
I just had one other quick question about the auditorium. And is it possible to reuse what we already have at Memorial School? And I know there's been some thinking about that, but that's a non-reimbursable expense. And
It is. Why don't we let these gentlemen here answer that one? Does that make sense to you, Scott, to take a run at that?
Scott Dunlap with AI3 Architects. We'll talk very, very briefly about it tonight as part of our presentation, but one of the options that was considered during the feasibility study phase was the possibility of keeping the existing auditorium. But we had to complete a structural analysis as part of our evaluation, and then do cost estimating on exactly what it would take to keep the existing auditorium, renovate it, and tie it into the any proposed remaining building, and make it comply or bring it up to compliance with all the seismic wind loading requirements, et cetera. And the cost estimate actually showed that it would be more expensive to keep that auditorium and renovate it than it would to build a new auditorium. And if you do keep it, if you were to keep it, let's say it was cost neutral and you just decided for sentimental sake you wanted to keep the auditorium. This has happened in some cities and towns. The MSBA would not pay for that as well. They would retract all of the money that you are spending to renovate that auditorium from your reimbursement. It would have the same net effect as it would have if you built a new auditorium.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Great. And obviously, any one of you can pick up the phone and call me, call Mr. Ailes at any time with follow-up. I'm thinking, why don't we take about a 2 or 3 minute stretch break, and then we'll go for about another hour. My sense would be that the presentation by AI3 might run 25 minutes or so, and then we can have some Q&A on that. So let's break very briefly and then get back together for another hour. Thanks. 3 minutes.
What's the duration of the class?
Duration
How
of
long
what?
is it planned?
Get a guy.
He's been. That's tough. Yeah. Get all of the, get a city hall in there, you can transition, or can you then retain it as an asset of the city for performance or for, I don't know, do we need it? You know?
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that building's kept doing anything to that auditorium.
I know.
It's a,
In the same,
it's a treasure.
the same fashion. What do you think you just talked about? Renovation, right? Through whatever.
Yeah.
Oh, I understand.
Starting from scratch.
I haven't been in there. I roughly know where it is. I can buy it.
Yeah.
I went there.
Yeah.
Did you go to Frisco?
Oh, no, as I said, we can't.
There's only two.
Yeah, Frisco.
Actually, there's only one school in Sorry. I went to this district.
Really?
They've already been.
But that's the 120.
I'd like to see it as mixed use. You know, I'd love to retain that. They say that if somebody wants, that if a tidal wave ever engulfed Beverly, it could take everything away. Frisco would still.
Frisco would stand.
It is. No, it's just extremely solid. It's got a bomb shelter in the basement.
The bones.
The bones are really strong.
It'll be very interesting to see what they do in the game, because they have
Have you seen the design?
Yeah. So, you know, so the exterior looks very similar.
I love it. I love it.
And within the building, there's not that much change. They're using the, like, the existing, you know, sixth grade classroom would be a bedroom. So they're using the footprints, the doorways. It's very interesting. And then off the back, there would be this sort of tail of town.
Right.
I'm thrilled over it. I think it was very thoughtful.
I also like the fact that they're going to extend the walkway around the
Yeah.
chiffon.
Yeah, they get that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's real nice. That'll be real nice. Someone who likes to walk.
Yeah, me too. It's lovely. And you get to that, it's like, I knew I was gonna do that when I saw him put it there. Yeah, I wonder about what, how much did we raise, did the private raise for the stadium?
You know who knows? It's Maria Decker.
And then when I think about the auditorium, although I believe that we didn't pay funding, but there's definitely a big people bringing the right funds.
Well, you know,
Or naming rights.
Good. I was sure you were.
Take that, don't really know the cost or.
Yeah?
How's everyone?
That's true too.
All changing.
I see what you were saying. It's all the same.
He said he had
I'll print out whatever you want. Take a look at it. There is plenty of letters that way. You're done, and all the companies did them, they call it in, they scrub anything from that. But you can take a look at it. It's yeah. I didn't know we were going to be able to cancel. I was playing
Not for now.
And I went back on the distribution list. You know what it is? I'll go back and I can't see the blank copy, but I'll have it analyzed. I want to see. Yeah, we check and did that.
Ow! Okay, let's get back together. So much for not having a gavel. If everybody could find your seats, we'll get started again. As I said, in hopes of being here for about another hour, perhaps less. Let us know when you're ready, BevCam. You're good? Okay. So, Scott, where'd they go?
He's coming right back.
So our presenters are somewhere in the building. Scott Dunlap and where's Troy?
Here, any second.
All right, we're going to wait. We're going to wait.
Yeah, if you want to move over.
Yeah, why don't I?
You can shut the camera back off. Pause it, whatever.
Yeah.
It's Troy's last name,
That's good.
Randall. You guys were sitting at attention for the whole time, and now your big moment's here.
I hope everybody's not worn out.
Here we are. So, yeah, are we ready now? Okay, so we have Scott Dunlap and Troy Manning. I'm sorry, Troy Randall. Peyton? So the gentlemen from AI3 are going to present an update on the design.
Thank you, Mayor Cahill. My name is Scott Dunlap with AI3 Architects. Just as the mayor mentioned, Troy Randall is here with me, should I falter, to help me. Just quickly, before we do any discussion on design presentation, I just wanted to respond to a couple of the cost questions and clarify. It is important to understand that we are in schematic design right now. So the cost estimates that have been completed on the project to date have been done in a very conservative fashion without knowing the specifics of the building, and some very conservative assumptions have been made. We wouldn't know at this point in time if we've got triple pane glass or double pane glass. We wouldn't know if we're a rubber roof or a PVC roof. There's so many things about the building that we wouldn't know. And so in these early stages, the cost estimators are asked to be very conservative. And that's why the suggestion that the building might cost $420 per square foot, we know that certainly we can do better than that. We just don't know until we have a chance to move into the various phases of design and get a lot more detailed about the specific building, how much we can continue to refine and lower that cost. And most of the time, those kind of significant cost analysis and value engineering decisions come during design development that we wouldn't even be moving into until after September. So from now until September, we're essentially in this schematic design phase. We're certainly, if we can make any decisions that we know globally will kind of reduce costs, we certainly will. Construction manager who will build this project will be coming on board, just as Tom Ellis from Erie and the mayor suggested, within the month, hopefully. And at that point in time, that entity will become our partner in helping us to determine the exact cost and how to analyze every single component of this project to determine if there are cost savings to be achieved. And it's a valuable relationship you don't have on every single project. This committee specifically chose to take a construction manager at risk approach, which means bringing that contractor into the camp very early on to help us do the very best we can in evaluating costs and controlling costs and lowering costs. So I just wanted to point that out. Now, the city has certainly been planning for many years for this project. and a lot of discussion has been going on. AI3, our firm, and Hearing International, your owner's project manager, we've been working together for almost a year now just on this feasibility and preferred schematic phases. And so during the feasibility study phase, we developed 8 different building options. 1,180 pages of documentation were submitted to the School Building Authority for review. We then got approval to move into the preferred schematic phase that we were in for quite some time. In that phase, we developed 6 building options, 340 additional pages of documentation, and then ultimately on March 25th, 2015, not that long ago, the Board of Directors of the Mass School Building Authority met to discuss your project specifically. And at that meeting, they unanimously and enthusiastically, which is not always the case, approved the Beverly Middle School project as an outstanding example of what every city and town in the Commonwealth should consider doing. So we're now, they essentially approved what that report said to move forward with the preferred schematic option. And so now we're in this schematic phase of developing, continuing to develop and refine that option. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that option is and what that preferred schematic option that the MSBA supported, the building committee supported, and we're now moving forward with involves. This is the existing memorial building site, Cabot Street along this edge, the existing memorial building here, the parking lot that you would drive into and readily recognize, the fields behind the building, Balch Street. You may or may not have realized that the property does have acreage in this corner right here, somewhat wooded, sloping uphill slightly. Just in general, the elevation or the grade level on the site drops about 10 feet from here at Cabot Street to somewhere down in here. Depending on exactly where you are, that can be as much as 12 or 14 feet. And then the site begins to climb up as you move in this direction. So we're climbing uphill again right here. It's about 17 acres. It would be considered an excellent site for development because of its size, the utilities that come to it, et cetera. So ultimately, it was the site that was selected after that feasibility phase and after the preferred schematic phase. The preferred schematic and the schematic option that we're moving forward with now involves the removal, the demolition and removal of that existing memorial building. You can see its footprint still in this particular site diagram here. And the development of a newly proposed building shown in the tan color underneath in this location. And you can see it also involves some field development that we're going to talk a little bit more about. But on this specific site plan, I just wanted to point out that this is that wooded area, that corner that I mentioned in the previous drawing, which is this area right here. And you can see there's a dotted line here. It represents the wetlands as they encroach just slightly on the site. Not a big impact to the site, but the lines you see there are indicative of the far inside line is the wetland boundary. And then there are a couple of setback lines. The most distant of one, which is this one, doesn't really impact us because we can still build in that. This one we want to stay out of. The proposed building on the site, and it's evolved over time, and continues to evolve as we try to make it more efficient in terms of its layout and then more academically appropriate. And so there are a number of things going on in the proposed building I want to talk about. We'll talk a little bit about the overall site plan first, and I'm going to go back and forth between these two drawings as we talk about that. The overall site plan certainly would have an access off of Cabot Street and an access off of Balch Street. Here you see a roadway coming in off of Balch Street. This is an entry off of Cabot, and then another entry exit off of Cabot. The site would allow us to propose new parking in various areas. Here we happen to show parking here, large parking lot here, large parking lot here, and then parking area back in this corner. And then clearly, we're showing some connectivity across the site between Cabot Street and Balch Street. Now, there has been a traffic study done on the entire area, and now that we're moving through schematic design, our traffic engineers will get involved in taking a detailed look at traffic patterns on the site. But we do know that by having this much roadway on the site, we can create a site that will have a lot of queuing area, a lot of drop-off area. We know that we can separate the bus traffic, for example, through a bus drop-off lane, entry, drop-off, exit, for example, off of Cabot Street from the auto traffic by either bringing the auto traffic in and around the building or bringing auto traffic in off of Balch. There are a lot of different options and scenarios we'll continue to evaluate as we continue to develop the design for the site plan, but we know that it's very efficient to have a couple of connections to Cabot Street here and then our connection to Balch Street, and we'll continue to evaluate then exactly what happens on site. Right now, we happen to show a roadway that comes all the way through and connects to that, and then a roadway that comes through and connects here. We don't know if that will necessarily be the final site plan. Again, cost, evaluation of traffic patterns, drop-off, pickup, all those things will go into the continued planning of the site. We know that we want to create 2 play fields on the site, create as much additional green space as we can on the site. We're showing, with all of the parking areas that you see here, somewhere between 375 and 400 parking spaces on the site, which is a very nice quantity for a middle school of this size. We know that we want to develop some green space. We want to keep nice buffers around the perimeter of the site and do a number of things to clearly be a good neighbor. We want the school to have a nice presence on Cabot Street, but not necessarily dominate Cabot Street. And then we want to leave a bit of a buffer between the building and Balch Street for that play area as we continue to develop it. The reason some of those things are important, and on this particular drawing, the only thing we've done is we've taken that proposed new building footprint that you saw in the previous drawing, and we've started to color code it by area. So we could talk about that a little bit. You can see the existing building still dotted in red right here, just to give you a sense of where the existing memorial building remains. And we're starting to conform the building to the site, not only for efficiency and trying to maintain a very compact plan, but making sure that around the building we can be very efficient in what we're developing, that parking can be efficient and orthogonal, and that we're not wasting any of the site area. So the proposed building would have a primary entry at the bus drop-off and pickup area at Cabot Street in this zone. We would want we're proposing that the Library Media Center would be located in this location, very prominent location, highly visible to visitors to see some of the dynamics that are going on in the Library Media Center. We know that we want to break the overall building down into individual academic neighborhoods. And so the 3 areas that you see right here, color-coded in blue, purple, and green, represent an academic neighborhood. Now, what does that mean? That means that approximately 120 to 125 students would exist in those academic neighborhoods at each grade level, and one single grade level would be on this floor, for example, divided up into 3 separate neighborhoods. And then on the second floor level, you'd have another grade level, 3rd floor, another grade level, and 4th floor, another grade level, so that each grade level is divided by floor and then is further separated into their academic neighborhoods We're also breaking down those academic neighborhoods such that the classrooms are located in a zone here, and we'll look at this in more detail on the floor plan, but we want to see you to see the relationship in the site plan. The area we call the maker-builder space, or the project labs, are located in a zone here, and then the dining space for each of those academic neighborhoods is located here, and all of that flows into an outdoor learning area. This area that sort of gets trapped between this section of the building and this section of the building becomes an outdoor learning area that we'll talk about in more detail as we roll into the specifics of the floor plan. Gymnasium and auditorium get located here. It's a nice location for them because it places the gymnasium close to the fields. It also makes these two spaces, which require a lot of public access, very close to this large parking area, and it will let us provide a separate public entry for nighttime use of those and isolate them from the remainder of the building, again, for that community and nighttime use. When I talked about the floor plan, I'm just going to go back and forth just for orientation here. We're looking specifically at this zone of the building blown up on the next slide. Here's the building again. Here's those color-coded academic neighborhoods. Again, stacking on 4 levels. So an entire grade level on this floor, subdivided into individual academic neighborhoods. And they're oriented this way such that they do have a very nice indoor-outdoor flow. And their building space, the project space for the students exists between their academic classrooms and their dining space and their outdoor learning environment. So when we talk about those maker, builder, project labs, and we're going to show a few images to give you an idea of what those are, but certainly there's, we've called it both an evolution and a revolution in the middle school learning environment over the last 10 years. And what the research shows is that the highest performing middle schools in the country are doing so by getting students actively involved in making and building with hands-on learning and tying that specifically to their academic environment and giving them reasons to understand what they're learning in social studies and apply, and what they're learning in math and apply it in science. And you've all heard about STEM, which is the combination of science, technology, engineering, and math, and now it's STEAM with the addition of arts and integrating the arts into all of those disciplines. So in each of these academic neighborhoods, this maker-builder space or this project space is where the students have the opportunity to spread out and start to actually execute those projects. And we'll show some imagery of some example areas. Outdoor learning environment is very important because it allows students to participate in a lot of outdoor science exercises, outdoor reading exercises, even specific classroom environments, art exhibits, all kinds of things that are happening now outdoors. I mean, we think of the classroom being the only place where you can learn, and what the research is suggesting all across the country is when you give students the opportunity to spread out and do those things both in a larger environment and a hands-on environment and outdoors, they don't just go nuts like we used to think they would. They actually respond extremely well with that kind of flexibility and freedom, and perform well. Attendance levels are up. Teacher retention is up in these kind of school environments. And so a lot of really positive things going on as a result of organizing the building for education. This is just one example of how that outdoor learning environment and its connections to the individual academic neighborhoods could be designed. Certainly we want to do some sort of outdoor amphitheater environment, maybe the possibility for a paved area or a plaza area, so students are given the opportunity to dine outdoors or even do their projects outdoors. The reason the dining area is connected to those academic neighborhoods and their project labs is to allow them to spread out and build bigger projects and actually do things in groups where they need more space. And in some instances, those even evolve to the outdoor environment. Exhibit space, science space in the media center. Certainly a lot of the idea of going to the library for a book is no longer as, as mainstream as it was 50 years ago. So the media center is more now about purely media retrieval and distribution. It's about video production. Students are learning to utilize media, data, and video resources to film their activities, to broadcast, to do all kinds of things that the media center really wasn't actively involved in even 15 years or so ago. And so there needs to be this real connection between those kinds of activities and the outdoor environment as well. So this is suggesting that that outdoor learning environment will wrap around and capture a portion of the media center as well. And will include exhibit areas. It happens to also be a really nice area for auto drop-off and pick-up in the morning and the afternoon. And it allows the educators and the administrators in the building, if they wish, to allow students to have this experience of coming into the building through these sidewalks and through these paths and through the outdoor learning environment into their specific academic neighborhoods, instead of being directed into the cafeteria, for example, as a holding area. They can come right on in through this outdoor learning environment and into their individual academic neighborhoods. This is a more detailed layout of the specific floor plan and how it might possibly function, in that it shows, again, this primary building entry. It shows how a circulation corridor can come right on through the building and connect to the gymnasium and the auditorium on this end of the building, and then the media center on this end of the building, with those dining areas spread along this outdoor learning area and along this exterior wall, and then direct connections to each of those academic neighborhoods. And you can see we're starting to suggest how classrooms will form themselves within those academic neighborhoods, and then the maker space or the project-based space will get integrated into the zone between those academic classrooms and that dining space and that outdoor learning environment. And that happens in each individual academic neighborhood. And then there are specialized areas like technology education, art, for example, that get integrated between the academic neighborhoods so that those functions, those programs can be shared not only by the students within those academic neighborhoods, but also they can flow into the project space, and that space can have connections to the art space, which can have connections to the technology education space. And all of the various disciplines start to tie together, and it makes it much easier to do cross-discipline instruction, teacher teaming, all the things that you're hearing about as sort of 21st century modern middle school education. Just like any building, we certainly have an administrative control point at that primary entry area that will involve, all kinds of safety, security features that will get designed into the building as we move through those phases. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll have a secondary building entry on this end that allows us to separate, if you wish, the building from the remainder of the academic area for nighttime use. The one really nice thing about this particular layout of the building and the floor plan and the way it's shaped is it does allow us to, even though the gymnasium is located here, it allows us to tuck that gymnasium down one floor below the main classroom floor level. So if you're coming in on this level, the gymnasium is a stairway down from that level you're on. And what it does is it allows us to contour the gymnasium to the site in a way that we don't have to do so much excavation and fill work on the site. So the building is starting to mold itself to the natural contour of the site sloping down. So if you look at that site plan that we looked at earlier, what we're essentially doing is, as the site is sloping down here, that gymnasium is dropping down one floor right here so that we don't have to come down to this area and do a lot of fill, or we don't have to come up to this area and excavate a lot of the site. This building kind of contours itself to the natural grade of the site. That's one of the reasons it's curving and going across the, kind of curving one way and going across the site at the same time. The second floor is very similar in that it's essentially just going to show that on the second floor level, you've again got those academic neighborhoods stacking up. The Library Media Center is a 2-story volume, so it's going to exist here. The upper level of the auditorium is going to exist here. And you go up to a 3rd floor. This is a complete grade level with 3 individual academic neighborhoods stacked on that floor. And you go up to a 4th level, again, a complete grade, isolated from the other grades somewhat, and then each academic neighborhood to further subdivide the student population. Was talking about the project space earlier. We will spend an enormous amount of time over the next year and a half designing these spaces. And so we wouldn't suggest that we know exactly what's going into every one of them at this early schematic design phase, but we're starting to discuss with the staff and administration how we provide all the necessary tools in those spaces to make certain that they can integrate across the various disciplines that are being taught to combine for projects and have the necessary tools, layout, table, space, amenities that they would need to execute those projects. And we're taking a look at successful middle schools across the country as we ponder some of the possibilities that that are available. This just happens to show some of those kinds of labs. This also shows some of those kinds of student learning activity project areas, and you can see they're always a little bit larger than the classroom, with a focus on making sure that you've got the storage, the layout space, and the space to spread out and allow students to do a lot of different kinds of activities. These are the kind of things that if you get squeezed into a classroom, you essentially are constantly having to break down all those projects and start again the next day, because that classroom has to be used by another group of students, or something else has to be taught there in the next period. And if you go into one of these buildings that has been built within the last 5 years that has these kind of dynamic spaces, what you see is learning going on all of the time, because the projects can stay up and can stay out, and there's not all this time lost with the students breaking down their project every day, or there's no limitation to the size of it because they're squeezed into a classroom, and it really puts learning on display as you move through that kind of academic environment. Just a summary of where we've been. We said earlier, or I mentioned earlier, that we had been through the preferred schematic, and that on March 25th, the Massachusetts School Building Authority voted to approve this project, approve the option that was selected, and move it forward further through schematic design. So that's what we're doing right now. This step 3, as identified here, is the step we're in now. It means that on September 30th of this year, we'll be submitting the final schematic design, and it's still schematic, which means it has a long way to go, but the final schematic design to the MSBA for their approval. And then just to give you a sense of the total project timeline, we'll go through a phase that we've identified as step 4 that's called design development. And that is certainly a phase where a lot of value engineering and cost analysis will continue to go on, and we'll look at ways to refine the building in order to make sure it's cost effective and we haven't compromised anything educationally. We'll then move into construction documents with a goal of wrapping up all of the construction documents in August of 2016. And all of this time in both of these phases, design development and the construction document phase, will be working back and forth with your owner's project manager, Huey, and the selected construction manager to take a look at everything that's being proposed on the project and continue to evaluate efficiency versus value. And then certainly if all goes well, the goal would be to have construction completed in the summer of 2018 and have an opportunity to move the school into the building during that period of time so that it's up and operating in September of 2018.
Good?
I rushed a little, did I go over?
You were great, you were great. Now you can understand why we're all so excited about the school to this point. Why don't we try to do the Q&A the way we did earlier? Any early takers? Yes, Todd.
Todd Strutt, on the Building Advisory Committee. Scott, could you go into like the second floor layout? Yeah. Off the green space, there's those two stairs. Those are the stairs you're intending to, or possibly be used as, depending on how administration wants to conduct flow into and out of the building. If you use that edge of the green space for vehicle drop-off, you're envisioning students cutting across the green space into those stairwells to, you know, if the seventh graders are on the third floor, for instance, they would use those stairs to egress up?
We have, hypothetically, we've talked about the fact that we have a number of stairs in the building, but we have these two stairs right here that we would describe as convenient stairs, which means they're not required by building code to egress the building, but instead they're just located in an area where we think it would make it very convenient to promote the kind of circulation within the building we want. And so one of them is here, and one of them is here. And this could certainly change, but the theory that drove their location is just as you described. If you did, in fact, want to almost completely segregate 5-6 population from 7-8 population, one of these could be a stair for use by 5th and 6th grade, one could be a stair for use by 7th and 8th grade, and then the pathways could be developed into the building. Two separate pathways could be developed into the building, and that whole procession could start as far out as the drop-off if you wanted it to, which would be unusual. Certainly, we have done 5 to 8 schools, and there have been 5 to 8 schools that didn't necessarily try to segregate them all the way out to literally the auto drop-off. But in this case, you certainly could if you wanted to, and then we'll continue to make provisions in the building itself to make sure that if you wanted to operate the building with that level of separation, the stairs, the hallways, the corridors, the key egress points would be in place to allow you to do that.
Just on that point then, Scott, could you go to the one of the slides that shows the whole of the building? Just to because it's so early on, Todd, right? So
yeah,
to keep in mind that, yes, we could use that pathway through the outdoor learning space into the building in the morning or out in the afternoon, or we could use the front door in, and that could be for buses, and there could be car drop-off down around by the auditorium gymnasium in. We could choose, I say we, it's really the school administration could choose that those staircases that we were just talking about into and out of the outdoor learning space, they may choose to use those solely and specifically for accessing the outdoor learning space. So there are a lot of options as we're very early on in the overall design, but sure, it may be that is a desirable way to get in and out of the building morning and afternoon as well.
We like the idea of having primary entry point here. We like the idea of having the entry point here, and then we like the idea of having these entry points here. And that's in addition to a number of other secondary exits around the building. But these 4 allow you, just as the mayor described, even if you didn't want to use the outdoor learning environment as an entry and exit procession from the building in the morning and the afternoon. You still have these two separate areas that would allow students to come down, go to a floor, and never have to circulate on one of those lower floor levels if they wanted to.
And then on the subject of
Movement?
vertical, elevators, I know there's a handy lift over in the auditorium. Is there a formal elevator that will serve the other academic levels?
There is. We've talked about utilizing an elevator close to this area, close to this entry area, and close to this entry area, and then possibly even introducing a third elevator if we needed to, at least minimally a service elevator in that zone.
The kitchen elevator?
Right.
Right, yeah, okay. Thank you.
Dr. Hirsch?
While Scott's on that slide, we had several teachers spend some time with us about the outdoor learning space. And what I like is, because they're always adding stuff, so the flow lines are what the teachers talked about that were most critical. So they want to be able to go from their classroom to the cafeteria work area and then right outside if in fact it made sense without having to march all around the building. So those flow lines is exactly what they were seeing as the advantage, and it would make it possible, not only possible, but it would make it so that Matt's biggest problem is going to be scheduling the outdoor learning space as opposed to are they going to use it or not. And that was a real critical piece of teachers thinking about flow.
School committee member Manzi.
With this most recent design, how many doors would this model contain? Entrance, exit?
I'll just point out the major ones, and then we can talk a little bit about the secondary ones. At the end of each one of these academic neighborhoods, there would be an egress stair, a true egress stair, which means it's fire rated from top to bottom, and you could get into the stairwell from any floor level and go all the way down and out the building. And you could set it up where a student on one level, once they get into that stair, can only go all the way out of the building and out, and make it a true egress stair so that they don't have the ability to move from floor to floor, but they do have the ability to just get out of the building entirely in the event of an emergency. But that will be an entry and exit door associated with that stair, and those will exist on the end of each one of these academic neighborhoods as we move around the site. There's the 4 entries I talked about earlier in terms of this one, the 2 in the courtyard. You'll see a sidewalk coming up here. There'll be what we consider very much a secondary entry point between these here and here. We feel like at this point in time those will primarily serve those art and technology spaces that exist between the academic neighborhoods, but they could in fact also become paths for getting in and out of the building as the building evolves. There's certainly a service and entry point associated with this area because the kitchen is going to be down in this zone, and so we'll have loading and receiving and some of those functions. And here, and a number of entries associated with it. And then, for example, at the gymnasium, just because of its size, it will have to have a number of egress points on probably a pair of double doors on this corner, pair of double doors here, pair of double doors here, potentially a pair of double doors in this corner, and then its final egress would be out of this primary egress point right here. And then we probably have the requirement to develop a handful of just smaller single doors around this perimeter where we've got some service spaces. We've got locker rooms going on the level below the auditorium, some things like that. So without providing a specific, there'll be also, I think I mentioned earlier, out of the media center, we'll have a series of doors that go out. And so all of those would be kind of the easily identifiable exit doors, most of which are just required as a result of emergency exiting from the building, not all of which you would be able to get into. Certainly, all of the schools we're doing now have complete access control systems. So from a computer, you have the ability to control every single door and when it may or may not be operable during the day, or certainly monitor its use during the day. And presumably, when the school is occupied and in the occupied safe mode, the majority of those doors would be exit only, and only probably all visitors during the day would have to enter and exit the building through the primary front doors, and there would be a control vestibule so that those people would have to move through administration and be monitored and allowed into the remainder of the building. So I don't want to imply that anybody could just come into any of those doors at any point in time.
Thank you, Scott. Councilor St. Hilaire?
Yes, I just want to agree with Mayor Kale. This is very exciting building design, and I know Dr. Hershey mentioned a desire to share more about the educational program, and I know you referenced some research about the highest performing schools being designed in this way, so I'm interested in learning more about that as well. I guess the question I have is, given the educational program, how does that affect the design compared to a more traditional program, and I guess on the construction cost side, what are the differences as well?
Well, one of the questions we were certainly challenged with early on by the building committee was the idea of making sure that even though we're configuring the building to support the educational program, we wanted to make sure that it was an efficient building. What does efficient building mean to us? Well, we had a number of conversations with the building committee where we described that an efficient building means that essentially all of the corridors in the building, any kind of circulation corridor through the building, is loaded on both sides. So you're stacking as many spaces as possible along your circulation corridor. That makes for a very efficient building. And then we continue to take a look at the floor plan to refine the amount of space that we were dedicating to circulation and make sure our ratio of usable academic space to just general circulation in the building was very efficient. And so this particular layout, although it may not be a rectangle or a square or a box, is actually very efficient in that you have one primary circulation corridor coming right through the entire building with everything sort of stacked off of that. And then you have into these academic neighborhoods one single corridor going directly. And by stacking this exact same shape on 4 different floor levels, you get a lot of economy in construction associated with the repetitive plumbing, mechanical, electrical on every single floor stacked up. And then, so there are a lot of efficiencies built into that alone. And then you get into things like natural daylighting, where we know we've got this southern sun coming from this direction, and we know we've got the north over here. So by having all of these classrooms turn north, they're getting great natural light, so they're not utilizing that much artificial light, and yet they don't have the heat gain from the sun. We know we'll have the sun coming into this outdoor learning environment, but that's a great location for it, and we can deal with the sun just on this one facade. And we've got something like the gymnasium that will have very few windows on this side, helping us sort of buffer the building from that sun and that heat gain. So there are a lot of things that are inherently in this floor plan that will make it a more efficient building. We have, in order to comply with a minimal level of LEED compliance, greenness, energy efficiency in the building, we have to introduce natural light into all of these classrooms, meaning you can't have a windowless classroom. The MSBA won't allow it, and we wouldn't do it anyway because it's been proven to just be poor educational practice. So all of these classrooms, certainly if this may look like, oh, you've got a wall, 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 but all we're really doing is providing a very efficient way of getting natural light to every single one of those classrooms and then stacking them right on top of each other so they repeat on floor levels, 4 different floor levels. And by splaying the building slightly, what we're doing is we're reducing the amount of distance between the academic neighborhoods. And by splaying them, we've got them far enough apart that if you're looking out one of these windows, you don't feel like you're just looking straight at another building, and yet close enough that we're taking very efficient use of that area between the buildings. So there are a lot of things inherently in this floor plan that are efficient. I mentioned the way we're contouring to the site. All of those things will reduce costs on items that you don't see or don't care about, foundations, footings, all those kinds of things. As we begin to move into designing the building three-dimensionally and talking about the exterior facades and where the windows and what is the material, then that kind of layering of cost analysis and making an economical building will continue to flow through all the decisions that we're making.
Thank you.
Councilor Lang.
Just to follow up on Councilor St. Hilaire's question, are there other communities right now that are using the academic neighborhood that we could rely on and kind of learn from as we go forward? Or are we pretty much out in the front here?
Yeah. There's certainly a lot of communities that are utilizing the concept of the academic neighborhood. Around 15 to 17 years ago, I would say that people started to write about the value of team teaching, cross-discipline instruction, breaking the students down into smaller schools, because essentially when we talk about sometime like 15 years ago they called it schools within a school, meaning you don't want the students to feel like they're overwhelmed in a 1,400 pupil school. If you can break it down to the point where they're primarily only dealing with their peers in a group of about 125 students, they have this sense of ownership. And so the concept of bringing together 4 or 5 classrooms in an academic team has been around for a long time. We are referring to it as an academic neighborhood because we're going a step further, and it's been done there are examples across the country. We're going a step further in that we're saying we're not only going to take those 4 or 5 classrooms and put them together in an academic team, we're going to make it an academic neighborhood. Now, how is that different? We're going to start to brand this area with signage and color and identifiable elements so that when these students come into this neighborhood, they recognize their work, they recognize the things they're working on, art projects, technology projects, etc. And as far as they know, they're part of a bigger school, but they know every single one of these teachers, they know every single one of these students, and they're very comfortable in that environment. They can feel very comfortable moving into their dining space, working in their project space, and not being intimidated by the larger school environment. And certainly that's been going on for a long time. We're integrating and building into their academic neighborhood this project space, this maker-builder space. I would say that evolution has only been going on more like 5 to 10 years, but there are examples of that having been done successfully. And then the concept of integrating the dining space so it can be used as that, used along in conjunction with all those spaces, is a relatively new concept. But even in Massachusetts, examples of schools that are doing that. So, yeah.
I just add, you heard Scott say earlier that when we were approved last month by the MSBA board to move into schematic design, they not only approved us unanimously, but they approved us enthusiastically, and that's an understatement. A couple of board members went so far as to tell the other 20 or so communities in the room that morning that this was really one of the best examples they'd seen of a school district developing and articulating a very strong, robust economic program and plan, and the collective team at this point in the process having begun to design a school that can absolutely deliver that educational program. And as I said, they went so far as to tell the other 20 communities, you need to talk with Beverly to find out how to do it right, because they're doing it right. And that's part of the excitement right now about where we're at and where we can get to with this school. A building that can be designed and built in a way that the educational program that we all know is right for the kids is deliverable every day of the year. Other questions? Dr.
I
Hershey?
think the only thing I would add to that is that it has raised the energy, commitment, and excitement of the teachers who will be moving into this building, and has changed conversations for us educationally in the district, and particularly for Matt at Briscoe right now. But also elementary teachers thinking about whether they want to be in the 5th grade, whether or not they're 5th grade teachers next when we open the building, because of the excitement and the opportunity to incorporate all of this together. So if you go back 15 years, we used to build pods for middle schools, but it was for the 4 teachers, and it was wrapped around, and the kids went out to do art, they went out to do technology. And the real difference right now is expanding the interdisciplinary opportunities for doing project-based learning, where the kids are taking what they're learning in the classroom and actually doing something that demonstrates their knowledge, as opposed to just regurgitating their knowledge. So it's been an interesting evolution.
If I could, actually.
Yes.
one more thing. So we presently have a teaming model at the middle school. It's something that's been in place for a number of years. The difference being that a team is located along a hallway and adjacent to another team on the adjacent hallway. So this clearly separates the teams into different neighborhoods. And at present, at the middle school, when a student goes off team, they're off team for foreign language, excuse me, foreign language reading, art, phys ed, music, band, so on. This model incorporates a lot of those functions in the neighborhood. And so they're really only moving off team out of their neighborhood for phys ed and band or chorus. And so we've been able to bring more into the neighborhood.
Councilor Silva?
Thank you. Is there any preparation from an academic standpoint that we need to
Lots.
get prepared for? I mean,
Speak to that? Yeah.
We're
No.
talking about the physical structure, which, by the way,
Yep.
looks amazing and fantastic. And I'm not a teacher, so you guys could speak to it better than me, but is there any...
Let me start, and then Matt can jump in. So one of the things that MSBA also required was that we delineate what our professional development plan would be for the next 3 years to have teachers ready to move into this building. We're looking at certifications, because we have to make sure we have certifications covered, because our goal is to make sure that teachers that are already working in Beverly can continue to work in Beverly. So we're doing that preparation right now. We're changing the conversations. We're actually not changing the conversations. We're stepping the conversations up.
And as Steve said, as we plan for what this new building could look like, we know the instruction in what goes on is going to be much different than we currently have. I've had staff come to me and say, can we start planning for this now? We just don't want to do it the first day we walk in a new building. We want to be able to transition now and start that process going forward. So that's been a discussion that we've had at the district level of how can we plan our professional development 2, 3, 4 years down the line, so that this is a seamless transition that we're going into as we go into this new building.
All right. Thank you.
We can adjourn.
Scott Hausman.
Councilor Hausman?
Yeah, I just have one question. Can you talk a little bit about how the current technology in the elementary schools and the technology in this school might be different, and what you sort of see kids at this grade level using in terms of technology? So sort of more specifically, the high school has a one-to-one laptop program. What kinds of technology do you see academically here, and how does that affect the potential construction costs?
Well, certainly I'll defer to Dr. Hershey for any specifics regarding their program, but I could speak to the building infrastructure in that technology is changing rapidly, but what we're seeing is smaller, less expensive devices all the time, and almost everybody even at the middle school level, within very few years, will be one-to-one, where all of our environments that we're providing for middle school and high school are completely wireless, unlimited access, indoor and outdoor. This entire outdoor environment would be wireless access as well, presumably. The technology is getting more robust, but the cost of it is coming down all the time. And one of the things we do with any of the building projects is we wait as long as possible to buy the technology, just because it is getting so much more robust at so much less cost all the time. So we would anticipate that in this building, it's a completely wireless environment with unlimited voice video data access in all locations for students. And by the time that the city moves into this school, I'd suggest that the size of the devices are going to be smaller. We don't do many built, there was a time when you had if you had 10 computer labs, that was really awesome. We don't do any computer labs anymore. You don't need a computer lab anymore. Everywhere is a computer lab. It's the same way with the Library Media Center. You don't really need to go to the Library Media Center to get information anymore. You can do it, anywhere in the building, and to suggest that you have to go to a special place to do that is silly. The Library Media Center is more about media production, video production, like I said earlier, broadcasting, teaching students how to work collaborative to use those resources. And so the Media Center tends to have a fairly robust infrastructure, and we'll sometimes do a handful. There might be, beyond the teachers' offices or their specific classroom computer, we may have another 20 to 30 machines in the building, depending on what applications. In the art lab, we might have some desktop computers for some of the more robust art applications. But it really is an environment that's going smaller, more mobile, and not necessarily more expensive.
And then from the academic perspective?
I could go an hour on this.
But you won't.
I won't. So one of the things that we're looking at right now is also trying to learn from the kids. So at the middle and elementary level, we're doing a lot of work with iPads and Chromebooks. And whether it's an iPad or another tablet device, it doesn't make any difference. So we know that it's going to be smaller, faster, and in many cases cheaper, largely because, like a Chromebook, all it's doing is accessing the web. And the resources and materials that the kids are going to need are on the web, so it's not necessary for it to have a lot of memory so they can keep the cost down. But learning from the kids is important, so we bought a lot of keyboards for kids to use with the iPads to take the park test and some of the other applications. These are not only digital natives, but these are natives to a different technology than the kids we've had before. So many of them are faster on their device's keyboard than they actually are on a real keyboard. So it's paying attention to that, because that saves money as you take a look at it. It was interesting because I was in one class and one of the kids, and it's interesting how digitally native they are right now. So one kid was working on a Chromebook, and he started pointing to the screen, trying to hit the icons with his finger, and then immediately realized that he wasn't on an iPad. So he adjusted to the Chromebook, didn't even skip a beat, and then went down to the keyboard. But that's who they are. So it's also learning that as we move forward. I was actually in McGraw-Hill yesterday, which is one of the larger publishers. They're moving over to online. So the access for us is going to be the most important part. So if kids are out working in the cafeteria in a group of 10 on a project, they're going to need to be able to have the access there to get the materials that they need online in order to do their project and do their research. So we really, I think the one thing we can say is that 100% access we will have. How we're going to access that will largely be what it looks like 3 years from now, and I'm not sure what it's going to look like 3 years from now. But it's exciting.
Dr. Hershey, do you want to just touch quickly on how you're trying to take the district technology budget from one-time funding sources to building a capacity
Sure.
into the budget each year?
What districts have done for a long time is when there's an amount of money available, they purchase a bunch of equipment, and then 5 years later, it's too old, and you're in a case where you have serious problems. So what we're trying to do now is slowly build an infrastructure over the next 3 or 4 years where eventually we have a dedicated $400,000 or $500,000 in our budget for upgrades and for replacement on a year-to-year basis. We're wrestling with leases at this point. Are leases the best way to do it or not? Because some of the issue with the leases is if you've got a 3-year lease, you already have money from the next budget cycle already committed to it. So making the most efficient use of that, but knowing that we have to build within the budget the capacity to be able to handle that over time as we move to a 24/7 environment, just like businesses are, where kids and teachers need access all the time, wherever they are. So we've made that commitment. In a large part, we're carving it out of the budget as opposed to building it onto the budget, you know, and how do we look at the resources that we've used in the past and how does technology replace that, so therefore we have some money that we can move over to help support the technology system. But the other part is we're pre-K-12 now with technology because the kids are coming to us knowing things. I mean, I have a 1-year-old granddaughter that somehow knows how to use her father's iPhone, so I haven't quite figured that out yet. But it's interesting as we start adjusting to that.
Any other questions?
One last,
Time.
if you don't mind. Scott, this layout is a pretty big massage from the first layout that you guys presented. What kind of tweaks are we going to be seeing in the future? Just, I don't expect it to be very dramatic.
Todd is afraid we're going to come back with a completely different plan next week. The one of the things, and what Todd is referring to for the city council members, we from the very beginning said we would continue to take input and morph this plan and work this plan until it was not only educationally the best it could be, but from a cost perspective, efficiency, site organization, fit to site standpoint, it was the best it was going to be. And so that involved working through a lot of iterations to get to where we are now. And we didn't show them all tonight because we wouldn't have had time to walk through all of them, but we think that it's very good. We think that what the building committee has developed and the reason the MSBA was so enthusiastic and board members who never say anything but negative were so enthusiastic about this project is we think it really is representative of a middle school that everybody will say, why didn't we do it that way? Why isn't everybody doing it that way? It makes perfect sense. That's exactly what we should be doing. And so we don't expect it to physically change in terms of the major pieces in the organization anymore. From this point in time, we'll be focusing on slight adjustments that improve, you know, either cost or academic efficiency or program adjacency. But we think it's settled into a very nice location on the site, and we think organizationally the major pieces are in the right location.
Thank you.
School committee member Manzi.
Just for clarification purposes, on our original model that we were looking at previously, there was 2 separate gymnasiums. Is that one, does that represent one on the map here?
Two full-size basketball court-size gyms. Is that what you're asking?
What I'm asking is that it's being shown on the plan a little bit differently than in prior.
It represents 2 full-size basketball courts, if that's
Right.
the easiest visual, correct?
Right. It does represent 2 full-size basketball courts. The area equivalent to 2 full-size basketball courts, one here and one here. How those get divided is still, you know, a point of conversation. Is that a solid wall? Is it a movable wall? Is it a soft partition? Is it a hard partition? But
And
Was
MSBA
there any
has,
space has, I guess, the number of square feet, how it was originally shown to us, does that differ than what we're looking at?
it does not. It's the same amount of program square footage as we originally put forward to the MSBA, and by program square footage, I mean the exact size of the space, and that has not changed.
Okay, my other question just would be.
Let me stop you for 1 second, then you can go back to it, but just to kind of, to put a punctuation mark on that point, MSBA has agreed that we need that much program space for 1,400 kids. It's, if you look at the 5, 6, 7, and 8, it's a significantly larger student body than one full-size gym could really provide for. So, go ahead.
I just wanted clarification purposes, because it looked like.
Like it might be one big gym. Yep, no, it's a good question.
Exactly. And my next question is based upon what we've seen on this particular plan. Prior plans showed a bus depot in the far right-hand corner off of Cabot Street, and that, yes. Is that still being designated as a bus depot?
Yeah.
From a design point, we're going to make that parking area to serve the site regardless, because it's a good location for that. But as far as we know, it's if there is no other location, that would be the bus parking.
Yeah, we've got to proceed with the expectation that we need that space for the bus depot. Anything else? Yes, George.
George Barris, the committee. The total square footage of the building, how does that relate to the magic number that the MSBA says per student?
It is exactly in line with what the MSBA says per student, with the exception of the portion of the auditorium that they are not going to reimburse.
Do you want to just take 1 minute to explain what they will and won't reimburse in the auditorium space?
We're proposing that the auditorium space be designed with fixed seating in the section that you see right here that has the lines through it. And by fixed seating, we mean typical auditorium style soft seating with aisles running between the seating. And then in the rear section that you see here, we have a band and music area that may or may not be tiered, but could be utilized in the event that you wanted to expand the seating in the auditorium for, say, a special event, and provide some movable seating in rows in this area to accommodate even more people viewing the stage or participating in an auditorium event. And this space that you see in the back area that would be the expansion area for the auditorium, that is a programmed band and music space that the MSBA will participate in paying for. And they'll also participate in paying for the stage area, because they recognize that as being a need in a middle school. So the area between the stage and this back music and band area would be the square footage that they would retract from the reimbursement.
Any last question? No? Then I'd like to thank everybody. Little bit long, but I think that the information shared tonight has been very valuable. And I'm grateful to BevCam for being here, because they will be able to edit tonight from the 2 cameras and get it out there for people to watch in the next few days. Counselors, school committee members, thank you for your time. And as always, to the building school committee, thank you for yours. As I'm looking at the calendar, I believe we are on for a Tuesday, May 12th meeting. Will be our next meeting, unless you hear differently. So that's Tuesday, May 12th, 6:30 p.m. right here for the school building committee. And again, thank you. A motion to adjourn? But we've got to close the other meetings, don't we? Why don't we do that first?
A motion to adjourn, city council? All those in favor? Aye.
A motion from the school committee to adjourn, please.
So moved.
Is there a second? All in favor? We're adjourned. Thank you.
Okay, and school building committee, motion to adjourn? So moved. Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Thank you all so very much. Have a great night.